In the first 4 months of 2025, China's car exports to Russia plummeted to just 155,000 units, nearly half of the 305,000 units sold during the same period in 2024. April alone saw a dramatic 70% drop in sales, marking a sharp decline from the previous high. Just a year ago, Chinese car dominated Russian streets, holding a 68% market share and leaving the local Lada brand far behind. Today, showrooms are shutting down, warehouses are overflowing, and dealers are cutting prices in a desperate bid to survive. Consumers have turned away, and in just a few months, the market has shifted from rapid growth to a systematic retreat. This is not a natural market correction, nor a sudden change of heart from consumers, and it's far from just poor quality or higher loan costs. This seems more like a well-prepared step-by-step economic restructuring. The Russian government has imposed heavy taxes, technical recalls, and policy restrictions, each layer building on the last. Consumer confidence has shifted from enthusiasm to doubt and even resistance. Meanwhile, Chinese automakers have been systematically pushed out. What's particularly interesting is the timing of this cleansing process, which coincides with several global events in the first half of 2025. Former President Trump's return, the temporary freeze of the Russian-Ukraine war, and potential signals of de-escalation between the West and Moscow. After all, a closer partner who was once supported during wartime and charged forward is now being calmly removed and gradually replaced. The smooth and restrained actions suggest strategic motives behind this process. This isn't just a sharp drop in sales, it's a geopolitical deconstruction of an industrial ally. This raises an important question: what exactly caused Chinese cars to fail? Was it a strategic miscalculation, or were they simply not allowed to stay? From bestsellers to losses, showrooms closing and trust eroding. According to Russian media Autostat, 213 Chinese car brands' showrooms closed across Russia in the first 4 months of 2025, involving major brands like Haval, Chery, Geely, and Chang'an. In Moscow alone, 28 dealerships shut down completely, with some even removing their storefronts. One Great Wall dealer angrily told the media, "Last year, the manufacturer pressured us to stock up, saying the market would keep growing. Now cars are stuck in warehouses and we can't even pay the security fees." This isn't just a drop in sales, this is a collapse of the distribution network. When the sales network falls apart, it means the brand has lost control at the consumer end. Car manufacturers can still produce reports, and consumers may still watch test drive videos online, but the physical showrooms have disappeared. In mid-2024, many dealers thought the dividend was still applicable, so they overstocked, ready to battle with full inventory. Now that stock has turned into sunk cost, selling even one car means losing money, and not selling is even worse. A Geely Xingyue L, once so popular it sold at a premium, had its price slashed by 200,000 rubles in the spring of 2025, and no one was interested. Chery's Arizo series even offered a buy one get one deal with 3 years of free maintenance. Chang'an's CS75 models offered free fuel cards, tax coverage, and registration, all to no avail. These discounts were actually dealers' attempt to exit while incurring losses. Some models' profit margins had fallen below 5%, even into negative territory. Many dealerships posted banners saying, "We're not making a profit, we're just trying to survive." More fatal than unsold cars is the fact that consumers no longer want to buy them. A video circulated on a Russian social media platform back in early 2025. A car owner was seen smashing the hood of his Haval SUV with a hammer on a negative 25-degree night. On the Russian platform Yaplakol, a Chinese car breakdown map appeared showing which car models had failed in which regions, with detailed descriptions of the issues. One user complained about a GAC fuel pump leak, and then when they approached customer service, they were told it's a normal phenomenon. Another Chang'an owner reported problems with the navigation system freezing, voice recognition glitches, and an inability to make calls. Some dealers even admitted, "We don't have a Russian language repair manual, so we suggest you return the car." The biggest weakness of Chinese cars is after-sales service has been fully exposed. At the same time, at the port of Vladivostok, used right-hand drive Toyota cars were being snatched up with prices rising by 15%. A 10-year-old Nissan X-Trail, only popular because it could start in winter, was in high demand. Russian users joked, "I'd rather drive an old Japanese car than be defeated by Chinese cars at the repair shop." The decline of Chinese cars in Russia wasn't gradual, it came crashing down. It wasn't a loss in competition, but a loss of trust. It wasn't about high prices. People simply don't trust them anymore. How were Chinese cars precisely cleared from the Russian market? The sharp decline of Chinese cars in Russia may initially seem like a natural correction driven by a tough economic environment and reduced consumer spending. However, when the timeline and policy changes are considered, it became clear that this downturn is far more strategically orchestrated than it first appears. It's not that no one is buying cars anymore. Chinese cars have been collectively pushed off the table through a series of coordinated policy actions. This approach isn't like the hard decoupling seen with the US or the transparent regulatory restrictions of the EU. It's distinctly Russian, precise, subtle, and skillfully executed. 3 strikes, each one equally fatal. This is not market behavior, but a systemic purge. The first blow came with the upgrade of the scrapping tax, which completely shattered the value for money advantage. In October 2024, the Russian government introduced new regulations, significantly raising the scrapping tax and environmental recycling fees on imported vehicles, with Chinese-made cars being a primary target. The official explanation was that this was part of ecological renewal and consumer-oriented upgrades, but it was clear to many that the real target wasn't emissions but rather the price advantage of Chinese cars. So, what were the effects of these new regulations? A popular Chinese SUV like the Chang'an CS75 or Haval H6 saw its price increase by 80,000 to 220,000 rubles after the scrapping tax, which is equivalent to 6,000 to 18,000 yuan. Mid-range Chinese models, which used to cost around 100,000 yuan, suddenly found themselves in the same price range as Korean and entry-level German models. The second blow came in the form of a technical attack. In February 2025, Russia's State Technological Regulatory Agency issued a mandatory recall for the GAC Trump-Chi GS8, citing fire hazards. At first glance, this seemed like a standard quality control issue. However, the risk wasn't new, and the timing targeting popular Chinese models raised questions about potential political motives. In the months that followed, several Chinese-made pickups and light trucks were stripped of their sales permits for a variety of reasons: failure to meet the latest safety certifications, emission tests not up to standard, non-compliant technical documentation translations, unregistered after-sales service systems. This reflects Russian version of non-tariff barriers. While it doesn't outright ban Chinese cars, it introduces a series of obstacles designed to make market entry nearly impossible. The second blow targeted the reputation of Chinese car brands, undermining consumer trust. In March 2025, the Russian Ministry of Finance dealt the third blow by adjusting luxury tax thresholds to include Chinese models priced over 1 million rubles. The affected models were Hongqi HS5, Tank 700, Trump-Chi GS8, and Geely Xingyuan L high-end models. These were the flagship models China had hoped would help its brand enter the high-end market. Once promoted as a sign of domestic brand reaching new heights, they were now pushed into the unaffordable category due to new tax measures. Take the Hongqi HS5 for example. Originally priced at 1.5 million rubles, the cost of increased by 300,000 rubles after the new 20% luxury tax was applied. As a result, consumers shifted to mid-range BMW or Volkswagen models at the same price. This was the third strike, limiting the brand's ability to grow and blocking future market opportunities. The impact of these policies is clear. Chinese cars are no longer seen as affordable. The brands are losing consumer trust, and their access to the high-end market has been restricted. The Russian government has made its decision. Chinese automakers must exit the market. China's initial success was due to Russia opening the door. Now, as Russia seeks to consolidate its industries and reshape the market, Chinese companies are being pushed out. The three-step process shows Russia's message. Thank you for your support during wartime, but your time has ended. For Chinese car manufacturers, the harsh reality is not just being excluded, but being denied the opportunity to respond. False prosperity, the passive rise of Chinese cars. The explosive sales of Chinese cars in Russia were not the result of market success, but rather a short-term benefit from geopolitical circumstances. Once the benefit faded, the illusion disappeared. With the outbreak of the Russian-Ukraine war, Western and Japanese automakers pulled out of the Russian market. Brands like Toyota, Ford, Volkswagen, and Hyundai closed their factories in Russia, halting parts and technical support overnight. This created a supply vacuum in the Russian car market. This vacuum was the window through which Chinese cars entered. However, this window wasn't because Chinese brands were stronger, better, or more reliable. It was because they were the only ones still willing to enter the market, supply cars, and take the risk of operating in a sanctioned zone. In other words, it wasn't a hard-won victory. It was a one-sided game where China was the only player left to fill the void. Russia didn't initially plan to hand the market over to China, but to stabilize wartime living conditions and boost consumer confidence, it implemented a 2-year special concession period from 2022 to 2024. During this time, tariffs were reduced, allowing Chinese cars to enter at a low cost. Certification standards were relaxed, enabling new brands to quickly register. Consumer loan interest rates were lowered to single digits, making it easier for families to buy cars. Government subsidies also encouraged the import of new energy and economy models, which aligned perfectly with the structure of Chinese car offerings. With Chinese cars, typical high-spec, low-price strategy, Chinese brands race through an unobstructed green light lane. However, it's important to note that these policies were never legally codified or long-term commitments. They were more like temporary exemptions granted during a special period. More critically, this consumer boom from Chinese cars was built on a Russian credit spree. In 2022 to 2023, Russia's central bank cuts its benchmark interest rate below 10% to stimulate domestic demand. Major banks offered low-interest car loans, with some even offering 0% down payment and 5% annual interest. Chinese automakers quickly adapted, promoting buy a car, get insurance, and 5 years interest-free deals. During this time, many Russian middle-class families engaged in premature consumption, purchasing large numbers of Chinese brands like Chery, Geely, and Haval, driving up sales figures. However, this growth was essentially a result of overdrawn future consumption. By the second half of 2024, the Russian central bank began raising interest rates aggressively to curb inflation. Loan rates surged to 21%, with some non-government banks offering car loans at annual rates as high as 50%, essentially amounting to usury for car loans. The direct consequences was a sharp drop in new car sales, and those who bought too early began to complain about Chinese cars. Low resale value, poor after-sales service, and difficulty selling used cars, leading to a public backlash. On the surface, Chinese cars seem like the winners in Russia's market from 2022 to 2024, but in reality, they were just a temporary solution to wartime crisis management. The Russian government never recognized Chinese brands as strategic market leaders, and consumers never developed brand loyalty for Chinese cars. Meanwhile, the dealership network, focused on quick profits, failed to establish a long-term service infrastructure. This is the reason why, once policy shifted, loans tightened, and the market began to recover, the entire ecosystem quickly unraveled. From the beginning, it had never been a stable foundation. Central Asia's backlash and Chinese manufacturing capacity. The retreat of Chinese cars from the Russian market is not just about unsold units or quality issues. It's a deeper story about Russia's quietly reconfiguring its geopolitical structure. The first step is this restructuring is to gradually reduce its reliance on China in the automotive supply chain. This process didn't start in Moscow, but began at the border points in Central Asia. Since 2023, Chinese automakers have increasingly adopted a detour export strategy, setting up CKD completely knocked down assembly plants in Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. They would export car parts to Central Asia where they are reassembled and then re-enter the Russian market under the label of locally produced, thus bypassing high tariffs and technical recertification. This detour route has been called the Central Asia Grey Channel. Data shows that in 2024, Kazakhstan alone re-exported over 158,000 Chinese cars to Russia, becoming a buffer zone for Chinese automakers and a safety valve for Russia-China trade. But Russia isn't blind to this. Russian media Vedomosti criticized, saying China is using Central Asia to encroach on Russia's automotive industry sovereignty. A member of the State Duma warned Chinese industry has penetrated our strategic backyard and it must be regulated. In early 2025, Russia's border customs system introduced new regulations requiring detailed sourcing information for parts used in Central Asia assembled cars, factory certification, and software source declarations. Russia had begun to realize that Central Asia is no longer a buffer zone but a platform for Chinese penetration. The broader context is that in early 2025, the Russian-Ukraine war reached a military stalemate, and Russia shifted its strategic focus back to its borders, making Central Asia a key area for reshaping its policies. Border control has been tightened. Vehicle flows are now subject to limited approval. There are now export quotas for Kazakh-assembled cars with annual limits on exports. Technical standards have been raised. Russian regulators now require Central Asian vehicles to meet local parts system compatibility, effectively excluding Chinese components. This is the first time Russia has set restrictions on Chinese manufacturing capacity in the export chain under the guise of geopolitical security. The logic behind this is clear. Initially, Chinese companies were allowed to address an urgent need. Now, Russia wants to handle the situation on its own and no longer wants them to take alternative routes. Not only the policies, but public opinion is shifting as well. On mainstream Russian social media platforms like VK and Yaplakal, similar comments have been spreading. We can't let Russia become a dumping ground for Chinese cars. Chinese cars drive like outsourced software and are as slow to repair as waiting for a delivery. China is building a colonial chain through Central Asia, not an industrial chain. After stepping out of Western colonialism, do we really want to fall into Eastern control? When Russia was isolated internationally, sanctioned economically, and stigmatized in the media, China was one of the few countries willing to take over. But as Russia looks to restore normal order and break free from dependency, the first target to be pushed out is often the one who took the most advantage when Russia was at its weakest. Unfortunately, the target is China. This wave of expelling Chinese cars is not just a rejection of complete car exports, but a backlash against the entire Chinese manufacturing ecosystem's strategic projection into Russia. Starting in 2025, Russia has quietly began implementing a series of systemic actions. These include upgrading origin certification for Central Asian vehicles to block the detour route for Chinese manufacturing, adopting a local priority strategy by requiring local manufacturing quotas and replacing Chinese car control system with domestic electronic control units. Public discourse has also shifted towards supporting re-industrialization, framing Chinese cars as external dependencies hindering local development. Establishing factories in Central Asia will not necessarily guarantee continued market access. Russia has moved away from viewing Chinese cars as a solution and instead sees them as an industrial risk that needs to be eliminated. The objective is to ensure that Chinese manufacturers exit the market entirely. This shift is driven by political consideration rather than economic calculations. Russia's version of joint venture backlash, how Chinese factories are becoming foreign launch pads. During the years when Chinese cars were rapidly exported to Russia, localizing production was seen as a key step for Chinese companies expanding globally. A notable example was the Great Wall Motor Factory in Tula, an investment of $500 million with an annual production capacity of 150,000 units. The factory, covering stamping, welding, assembly, and painting processes, was hailed by CCTV as a flagship project for Chinese manufacturing entering the European market. By 2025, the Tula factory once prominent status has faded and is now being nationalized quietly. Once seen as a strategic foothold for Chinese companies abroad, the factory is becoming a transit station in Russia's industrial strategy designed to absorb Chinese equipment, technology, and operational experience with the ultimate goal of reducing dependence on China and taking control. The Russian Ministry of Industry and Trade is now requiring that at least 70% of the components used to be sourced locally. The Russian government has included the Tula factory in its strategic key industries list, which limits technology exports and profit repatriation. Negotiations have repeatedly emphasized demands for sharing technical data, localizing service data, and transferring equipment maintenance authorization. In simple terms, while Russia welcomes Chinese companies to set up factories, it is quietly absorbing their operations, restricting control, and only allowing them to provide tools. A Chinese engineering consultant who was involved in the early setup of Tula factory admitted, once you taught them, they'll shut the door and go do it on their own. Ironically, Russia's approach to Chinese cars mirrors China's past dealings with Western automakers. In the past, China encouraged foreign investment, joint ventures, and technology partnerships. Now, Russia is welcoming Chinese companies to build factories and supporting them with policies. China provided policies and sales, and foreign companies made huge profits. Similarly, Russia turned on the green light by lowering interest rates and opening the market. Next, China started demanding localization and limiting new brands, and Russia followed suit with demands for technology transfer and local component ratios. Later, China pushed for the rise of domestic brands, learning and replacing foreign companies along the way. Russia is now promoting LADA's integration and local electric vehicle projects. In the final phase, China forced joint ventures with foreign companies, ensuring Chinese companies held majority control. Today, Russia has included the Tula factory as a national strategic asset, with all data, technology, and operations being safely managed locally. In short, Chinese cars are being gradually pushed out of Russian market using the same tactics China once employed with foreign companies. As the saying goes, what goes around comes around.